I've found that GitHub Copilot can be a great assistant, both for personal and work projects. I'm Pamela, a cloud advocate at Microsoft, focused on Python. After just a few months of using Copilot, I find myself using it more and more, and I want to share some tips with you. If you're new to Copilot, be sure to watch this video here. There's also a great video by my colleague Alfredo about using Copilot to turn a command line app into a fast API app. This video is all about best practices for prompting Copilot. My examples are in Python, but the practices apply to all languages. On a high level, remember these two things. 1, provide context, and 2, be predictable. Let's explore some situations to see what I mean by that. Let's start with an example of just a single file Python program to process a bit of JSON. Now, one way that I'm going to provide context to Copilot is by keeping that JSON open in another tab in VS Code, so that gives a good clue that this is what we're working on. I'm also going to start my file with a high-level comment about what we're doing. Description, this file processes talks.json. Now, a nice thing to do is to start off with imports. If we know for sure that there's a particular module or package that we're using, it's really good to start off by importing it because that gives Copilot really nice context to decide how to manipulate things. Because there's many different ways of doing something in Python. We're going to give it a little heads up that this is how we want to do it. So I will go ahead and import JSON like it suggests. And then I'm done with my imports and I want to read the file in. And I like everything suggested here. The only thing I'm going to change is this variable name. As a general best practice, it's nice to have really specific variable names that can give more hints about what a particular variable is. So instead of data, which could represent anything, any data type and any sort of thing, I'm going to say talks. And I'm even going to use a Python type annotation to specify that this is a list. It's not necessary to use a type annotation, but if you're in a language where you do have types or type hints, it's a nice thing to do. Now, in order to process this and manipulate in some way, I'm actually going to write some functions. We don't have to write functions, but I like to write functions. It helps me keep code more organized and it's easy to test them. Well, I'm going to make a function here that's going to filter talks by tag. And I gave it a really nice function name, right? And just based on that function name, we have a whole suggestion from Copilot. I like this suggestion. It says what it's going to take in. And notice that now it's using type annotations for its suggestions because it saw this one type annotation here. So this is cool because, I can get type annotations for free. And it says that this is returning a new list. This is important too because we could have actually processed the original list, but I did actually want to return a new list. And that's something that helps to specify as well. One thing that's interesting here is that it made the design choice to use a filter function. That's a built-in function for Python, which you can filter a list or any iterable and then turn that back into a list. This is all fine and good and it should work. But I actually want to use a list comprehension because I prefer list comprehensions myself. So in the comment here, I'm just going to give it a little hint to use a list comprehension. And then I'll go in here. And this time it uses list comprehension, and I prefer that. Now let's try it out. Say Python talks equals filter talks by tag Python talks. All right. And then we'll print those out. It seems like that worked, but I want to be able to view these results a bit nicer. So I'm going to make a function for pretty printing talks. So up here, I'll say pretty print talks. And let's see what it suggests. This looks good here. So title by speaker. I don't need speaker because I'm actually the speaker of all these talks. These are my own talks. I want to just move the tags up into here. All right, so let's take a look at what this looks like. Okay, that looks nice, except that the tags are a little nerdy looking because they're actually coming out as a list. We might want them as just a comma separated list without the brackets. So let's say, format tags as comma separated list. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this and see the suggestion. It really, really wants that speaker there. I'm going to delete it again. What I should have done is up here said title tags, and here we go. Now let's try it out. There we go. That looks a lot nicer. What we've seen here is that it's helpful to provide context. Sometimes that context is another file that's open. Sometimes it's, a comment, whether on the function or the module. Maybe it's a well-written function name or parameter names. Sometimes it's an inline comment just to guide it along the right path. The more context you can give to help it figure out which way to go, that's really going to help it out. Now I'm going to do a bit of database model design using the SQLAlchemy Python package. So let's say we're going to define models for a restaurant application using SQLAlchemy. So let's start with the imports and let's see what's suggested. So we see some standard library imports, some SQLAlchemy imports, and hopefully that's enough. So it's suggesting to create a instance of declarative base class. It's going on to actually create the models. So for restaurant, it's got a table name as it should, and an ID and a name. Let's also add an address and a phone. So this did work. However, what's interesting is that SQLAlchemy recently came out with a new version, SQLAlchemy 2.0, and it has a fairly different interface because it is trying to work better with Python type checkers. Copilot suggested code using the previous interface, which will actually still work. It's backwards compatible, but isn't as modern as it could be. So in cases like this, what I like to do is actually give Copilot more context by providing an example straight from the documentation, straight from the horse's mouth. So I'm going to go to the documentation for SQLAlchemy, and here is their ORM quick start. So I'm just going to go ahead and actually delete all of this and start with their quick start. Copilot doesn't need a lot of information, it just needs a hint. So let's leave one of the classes in here and say we're going to define model for restaurant with, name, address, phone. Let's see what it suggests. So this is really cool. This time, everything it suggests is using the new way of defining models in SQLAlchemy 2.0. So all it needed was a little bit of context, an additional example to show like, hey, we're using this more modern way of using SQLAlchemy, and it was able to figure out how to make a better suggestion. And now I can delete this example from the docs and just stick with my restaurant model. So the takeaway here is that if you are using a third-party package, it's always a good thing to double check the documentation, see if your code looks like what you see in the documentation. If the interface has changed, just give Copilot a little hint by pasting in some examples from the docs. That's all it needs to get started. Now let's use Copilot to add features to an existing code base. The one I'm working on is a simple restaurant review app. It's one of our sample apps for Azure tutorials. So it already has the ability to add restaurants and to add reviews for restaurants. It's written in the Django framework, which is a Python web framework, which roughly follows an MVC architecture, more like an MVT architecture. So it's got models, it's got views, and it's got templates. So what I want to do is add a new feature to the site, a discussion forum about food. In Django, what you do in order to create, a new set of models, views, and templates is actually make a whole new directory. So I can do that now. Let me drag this out here. Now I'm going to start using Copilot to write this food form. Since Django is an MVT framework, you might think like, well, what should we start with? The models, views, or templates? I'm going to recommend always starting with the models because everything basically builds on top of those models. So I'm going to create a new model, a new file, models.py, and I also am going to open the previous models.py to give Django some context, and I'll even bring in the import from here. So I'm going to say we're creating models for a discussion forum about food. Users can make posts and reply to posts. It's going to start suggesting how to define this model. This looks good. So each post can have a title, can have a text, and can have a date. And we could add a string function as well for easier debugging. Then I also need a reply model. And this one is related to the post model, so it did add a foreign key. And replies only have text, and they can have a date as well. Next, I'm going to add views.py because that really builds nicely on top of models. So we'll say these are the Django views for the food form app. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and open the views from the other part of the site, the restaurant review site, so that it sees this as an example. Now we'll start with the imports. And it has a variety of imports. I don't know that we're going to use all these. If we don't end up using them, my linter will let me know that it's a good thing to delete them. We're definitely going to use the models though, so I'm glad that it imported those. Now we're going to create the views. So the index page should probably list all the posts. And that's actually exactly what it suggested. So it's grabbing all the posts and passing them as template variables into the index.html template. Of course, this template doesn't exist yet, but we can do that next. Now we want to post page, right? We want to see a post. So that page will be passed an ID and it will fetch the post. We also want to fetch the replies. So let's get those replies and see if it amends its suggestion here. It does. So good, we're passing in the post and the replies. We also need a create post page as it suggests. That is just going to render a form. We also need a function that can handle the submission from that page. So that's what's coming next here. Add post. So this should actually parse the form input and create a new post object. So here we see it's getting the title, it's getting the post text, it's setting all of these, and it looks like the attribute names do match the column names from models.py. So I'm very happy about that. Finally, we need a way to add a reply. I think we'll have the add reply form in the post page itself, but we need to be able to handle the post that comes. So this should be handling a post request. So you see it's getting information from request.posts. It is creating a reply object. So the big points I want to make with this example is to think about what order you develop your code base in. I think it makes sense to start with database models and API schemas, and then build on top of those. And also consider what files would be useful to have open to provide additional context. You want the files that are showing what particular models are being built off of, but in this case, we also want to see what does views.py look like for another feature of the site. So there's kind of two types of context that we're giving in terms of these files. As you can see, if we provide good context to Copilot and some comments to guide it along the path, it can really provide a lot of help in crafting applications, especially when we're working on web applications that follow predictable structures like MVC applications. Do you remember what I said at the beginning? Provide context and be predictable. Context can be in the form of open files, comments, import statements, function names, data types, and sometimes the best context comes from external documentation pasted in. Predictable program is one that uses standard naming conventions across variables and files, or even uses a consistent architecture like MVC. There are some situations where Copilot won't be as helpful, where there isn't enough context or your code is really just new and different, but there are so many situations where Copilot can be a highly productive pair programmer for you, especially when you give it some extra guidance. Of course, for all code that you write, whether with Copilot or not, you should always test it and aim for 100% test coverage at the minimum. Fortunately, Copilot can help with that too. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe, and check out the other videos from the series too. Thanks for watching!